아침이 밝아오면 생각나는 보일 듯 말 듯 아련한 꿈 하나 나만을 바라보던 너의 그 눈빛 다가서면 닿을 듯한 너의 향기가 높은 곳으로 날
Hello everyone. So today I'm gonna read some ghost stories. It's called The Best Ghost Stories Ever. Edited by Christopher Cravatin. It's a scholastic book. Let me see what it has. Empty House by Algernon Blackwell. Monkey's Paw by W. Jacobs. Legend of Sleepy Hollow by Washington Irving. Mask of the Red Death by Edgar Allan Poe. The Judge's House by Bram Stoker. I was going to call him Stroker for some reason. I don't know why. A Ghost Story by Jerome K. Drum. Yeah. The Yellow Wallpaper by Charlotte Perkins Gilman. If I remember correctly, I did read The Yellow Wallpaper before, and I really liked that. The Romance of Certain Old Clothes by Henry James. And The Story of Clifford House by Anonymous. I'm not sure how long it'll go, but I'll go until my voice can take it anymore. I doubt I'll read this whole book. If you want to know more about the book, you can do exclamation book, if I remember correctly. I think I set it up right. Let me make sure. Yeah, I did. Alright, so on the back, there's like nothing on the inside covers because it's a paperback. But on the back it says haunted, spooky, chilling. Watch where you step. Be careful what you do. Ghosts are everywhere, in houses new and old, in lonely walks and grim gatherings, underneath the wallpaper, riding through the night. These are some of the spookiest ghost stories ever written, from authors including Edgar Allan Poe, Robert Louis Stevenson, Bram Stoker, and Henry James. Prepare to be haunted. I was gonna read this on my own, but I figured since we're all stuck inside, I'm gonna stream reading it, so other people can listen to something I just got hair in my mouth by taking off my glasses. I hope that I think this will work, because I have to like take my glasses off and hold the book up to actually read it, because my glasses aren't any good up close, and I can only read the book up close. And since I'm just reading the book, I'm not having my camera on, just a little cute little picture I found. I don't remember where I found it. I should have written it down. It was like, I think I googled free use fireplace gifts or something. The first story is The Empty House by Algernon Blackwell. I'm pretty sure that's what you say his name. Certain houses, like certain persons, manage somehow to proclaim at once their character for evil. In the case of the latter, no particular feature need betray them. They may boast an open countenance and an ingenious smile, and yet a little of their company leaves the unadulterable conviction. And my dog is snoring as always. Where was I? Unadulterable conviction that there is something radically amiss with their being, that they are evil, willy-nilly, They seem to communicate in an atmosphere of secret and wicked hiccups. Sorry. I forgot where I was at. Willy-nilly, they seem to communicate at an atmosphere of secret and wicked thoughts, which makes those in their immediate neighborhood shrink from them as a thing disease. As from a thing disease. And perhaps with houses, the same principle is operative. And it is the aroma of evil deeds committed under a particular roof, long after the actual doers have passed away, that makes the goose flesh come alive and the hair rise. Some things of the original passion of the evildoer and of the horror felt by his victim enters the heart of the innocent watcher, and he becomes suddenly conscious of tingling nerves, creeping skin, and a chilling of the blood. He is terror-stricken without apparent cause. I hope my dog isn't snoring too loud. There was manifestly nothing in the external appearance of this particular house to bear out the tales of the horror that was said to reign within. It was neither lonely nor unkempt. It stood, crowded into a corner of the square, and looked exactly like the houses on either side of it. It had the same number of windows as its neighbors, the same balcony overlooking the gardens, the same white steps leading up to the heavy black front door, and in the rear, always the same narrow strip of green, with neat box borders running up the wall that divided it from the backs of the adjoining houses. Apparently, too, the number of the chimney pots on the roof was the same. The breadth and angle of the eaves, and even the height of the dirty area railings. And yet, this house in the square that seemed precisely similar to its 50 ugly neighbors was a matter of fact entirely different, horribly different. The page just hit me in the face. Wherein lay this marked, invisible difference is impossible to say. It cannot be ascribed wholly to the imagination, because persons who have spent some time in the house, knowing nothing of the facts, I don't know why I say nothing. Nothing. Knowing nothing of the facts, had declared positively that certain rooms were so disagreeable they would rather die than enter them again, and that the atmosphere of the whole house produced in the symptoms of a genuine terror, while the series of innocent tenants who had tried to live in it and forced to decamp at the shortest possible notice was indeed little less than a scandal in the town. When Shorthouse arrived to pay a weekend visit to his Aunt Julia in her little house on the seafront at the other end of town, he found her charged to the brim with mystery and excitement. He had only received her telegram that morning, and he had come anticipating boredom. But the moment he touched her hand and kissed her apple-skin, wrinkled cheek, he caught the first wave of her electrical condition. The impression deepened when he learned that there would be no other visitors, that he had been telegraphed for with a very special object. What? It just sounds good. And that he had been telegraphed for with a very special object. Should he use for after with? I don't know when the story was written, but this sounds like old people talk. They like real old. Who wrote this again? Algernon Blackwell? Algernon sounds like an old name, so it was probably like a couple years old story. So I think that's just how they wrote and talked back then. I think for with is like because. Like the word because, I think it's synonym. Alright, let's get back to the story and not analyze all the grammar. Something was in the wind, and the something would doubtless bear fruit. For this elderly spinster aunt, with a mania for physical research, has brains as well as willpower, and by hook or by crook, she usually managed to accomplish her ends. By hook or crook, that means you either get it by force or you get it by cheating. Hook and crook. The revelation was made soon after tea, when she sidled, S-I-D-L-E-D, sidled, I don't know. When she sidled close up to him, as they paced slowly along the seafront in the dusk. "I've got the keys," she announced in a delightful, yet half awesome voice. "Got them till Monday." The keys of the bathing machine, or they had bathing machines back in like the Victorian times, so I guess this is back then or like a little after. The keys of the bathing machine, or, he asked innocently, looking from the sea to the town. Nothing brought her so quickly to the point as feigning stupidity. "Neither," she whispered. "I've got the keys of the haunted house in the square, and I'm going there tonight." Shorthouse was conscious of the slightest possible tremor down his back. I get hiccups again. Where was I? He dropped his seasoned tone. Something in her voice and manner thrilled him. More hiccups. She was in earnest. "But you can't go alone," he began. "That's why I wired for you," she said with decision. He turned to look at her. The ugly lined, enigmatical face was alive with excitement. There was the glow of genuine enthusiasm around it like a halo. The eyes shone. He caught another wave of her excitement, and a second tremor, more marked than the first, accompanied it. "Thanks, Aunt Julia," he said politely. "Thanks awfully. I should not dare to go quite alone," she went on, raising her voice. "But with you I should enjoy it immensely. You are afraid of nothing, I know." "Thanks so much," he said. Again, is there Anything likely to happen? A great deal has happened, she whispered, though it's mostly been cleverly hushed up. 3 tenants have come and gone in the last few months, and the house is said to be empty for good now. In spite of himself, Shorthouse became interested. His aunt was so very much in earnest. The house is very old indeed, she went on, and the story, an unpleasant one, dates a long way back. It has to do with a murder committed by a jealous stableman who had some affair with a servant in the house. One night he managed to secrete himself in the cellar. When everyone was asleep, he crept upstairs to the servants' quarters, chased the girl down next to the landing, and before anyone could come to the rescue, threw her bodily over the banisters into the hall below. Threw her bodily. Is it like forced? Through her whole body? I don't know. And the stableman was caught, I believe, then hanged for murder. But it all happened a century ago, and I've not been able to get more details of the story. Shorthouse now felt his interest thoroughly aroused, but though he was not particularly nervous for himself, he hesitated a little on his aunt's account. On one condition, he said at length. Nothing will prevent my going, she said firmly. But I may as well hear your condition. That you guarantee your power of self-control if anything really horrible happens. I mean, that you are sure you won't get too frightened. Jim, she said scornfully. I'm not young. I know. Nor are my nerves. But with you, I should be afraid of nothing in the world. This, of course, settled it, for Shorthouse had no pretensions to being other than a very ordinary young man, and an appeal to his vanity was irresistible. He agreed to go. Instinctively, by a sort of subconscious preparation, he kept himself and his forces well in hand the whole evening, compelling an accumulative reserve of control by that nameless inward process of gradually putting all the emotions away and turning the key upon them. A process difficult to describe, but wonderfully effective, as all men who have lived through severe trials. Start that over. Where was I? I lost. I lost my place. Hold on. As all men who have lived through severe trials of the inner man well understand. Later, it stood him in good stead. But it was not until 10:30 when they stood in the hall, when they stood in the hall, well in the glare of friendly lamps, and still surrounded by comforting human influences, that he had to make the first call upon his store of collected strength. For once the door was closed, he saw the deserted, silent street stretching away white in the moonlight before them. It came to him clearly that the real test that night would be in dealing with 2 fears instead of 1. He would have to carry his aunt's fear as well as his own. And as he glanced down at her sphinx-like countenance and realized that it might assume no pleasant aspect in a rush of real terror, he felt satisfied with only one thing in the whole adventure, that he had confidence in his own will and power to stand against any shock that might come. Slowly they walked along the empty streets of the town. A bright autumn moon silvered the roofs, casting deep shadows. There was no breath of wind, and the trees in the formal gardens by the seafront watched them silently as they passed along. To his aunt's occasional remarks, Shorthouse made no reply, realizing that she was simply surrounding herself with mental buffers, saying ordinary things to prevent herself thinking of extraordinary things. Few windows showed lights, and from scarcely a single chimney came smoke or sparks. Shorthand had already begun to notice everything, even the smallest details. Presently they stopped at the street corner and looked up at the name on the side of the house, full in the moonlight, and with one accord, but without remark, turned into the square and crossed over to the side of it that lay in shadow. Let me get a sip of water. The number of the house is 13, whispered a voice at his side, and neither of them made the obvious reference, but passed across the broad street of moonlight and began to march up the pavement in silence. It was about halfway up the square that Shorthouse felt an arm slip quietly but significantly into his own, and knew that can I stop having hiccups? I knew that their adventure had begun in earnest, and that his companion was already yielding a long word. Imperceptibility to the influences against them. She needed support. A few minutes later, they stopped before a tall, narrow house that rose before them in the night, ugly in shape and painted a dingy white, sort of round. I guess I don't know. Night and white, yeah. Shutterless windows, without blinds, stared down upon them, shining here and there in the moonlight. There were weather streaks in the wall and cracks in the paint, and the balcony bulged out from the first floor a little unnaturally. But beyond this generally forlorn appearance of an unoccupied house, there was nothing at first to single out this particular mansion for the evil character it had most certainly acquired. Let me get another sip of water. Oh, I almost dropped my cup. The little table I have it on, it's not level. It's inside of like up and the center is like curved down, which is weird. Alright. Taking a look over their shoulders to make sure they had not been followed, they went boldly up the steps and stood against the huge black door that fronted them forebodingly. But the first wave of nervousness was now upon them, and Shorthouse fumbled a long time with the key before he could fit it into the lock at all. For a moment, if truth were told, they both hoped it would not open, for they were a prey to various unpleasant emotions as they stood there on the threshold of their ghastly adventure. Shorthouse, shuffling with the key and hampered by the steady weight on his arm, certainly felt the solemnity of the moment. It was as if the whole world, for all experience, seemed at that instant concentrated in his own consciousness, were listening to the grated noise of that key. A stray puff of wind wandered down the empty street, woke a momentary rustling in the trees behind them. But otherwise this rattling of the key was the only sound audible. And at last it turned in the lock, and the heavy door swung open and revealed a yawning gulf of darkness beyond. With a last glance at the moonlit square, they passed quickly in, and the door slammed behind them with a roar that echoed prodigiously through empty halls and passages. But instantly with the echoes, another sound made itself heard, and Aunt Julia leaned suddenly so heavily upon him that he had to take a step backwards to save himself from falling. A man had coughed close behind them, so close that it seemed they must have been actually by his side in the darkness. Shit. So there's somebody in there with him. There's actual ghosts in there. I'm not gonna make any COVID-19 jokes. But you gotta practice social distancing, You can't be right up next to people coughing on them. With the possibility of practical jokes in his mind, Shorthouse at once swung his heavy stick in the direction of the sound. But it meant nothing more solid than air. He heard his aunt give a little gasp beside him. "There's someone here," she whispered. "I heard him." "Be quiet," he said sternly. It was nothing but the noise of the front door. "Oh, get a light, quick," she added, as her nephew, fumbling with a box of matches, opened it upside down and let them all fall with a rattle onto the stone floor. The sound, however, was not repeated, and there was no evidence of retreating footsteps. In another minute they had a candle burning, using an empty end of a cigar case as a holder. And when the first flare had died down, he held the impromptu lamp aloft and surveyed the scene. It was dreary enough in all conscience. But there was nothing more desolate in all the abodes of men than an unfurnished house, dimly lit, silent, and forsaken, and yet tenanted by rumor with the memories of evil and violent histories. They were standing in a wide hallway. On their left was the open door of a spacious dining room, and in front the hall ran, ever and narrowing, into a long, dark passage that led apparently to the top of the kitchen stairs. The broad, uncarpeted staircase rose in a sweep before them, everywhere draped in shadows, except for a single spot about halfway up where the moonlight came in through the window and fell on a bright patch the moonlight came in through the window and fell on a bright patch on the boards. This shaft of light shed a faint radiance above and below it, lending to the objects within its reach a miserably I'm almost out of water. Oh, I haven't read out loud in a long while. I guess that's why my throat is like, Alright. Leading to the objects within its reach a misty outline that was infinitely more suggestive and ghostly than complete darkness. Filtered moonlight always seems to paint faces on the surrounding gloom, and a short house peered up into the well of darkness and through of the countless empty rooms and passages in the upper part of the old house. I lost my place. He caught himself longing again for the safety of the moonlit square, or the cozy, bright drawing room they had left an hour before. Then, realizing that these thoughts were dangerous, he thrust them away again and summoned all his energy for concentration on the present. "Aunt Julia," he said out loud severely, "we must go now through the house from the top and bottom and make a thorough search." Hold on. I gotta stretch my back. It's starting to hurt. Okay. Alright, you read that. The echoes of his voice died away slowly all over the building, and in the intense silence that followed, he turned to look at her. In the candlelight, he saw her face was already ghastly pale, but she dropped his arm for a moment and said in a whisper, stepping close in front of him, "I agree. We must make sure there's no one hiding. That's the first thing." She spoke with evident effort. Evident? I guess. I never really heard. I've only heard evidence said a lot. Never evident. There's no R in it. Evident. She spoke with evident effort, and he looked at her with admiration. "You feel quite sure of yourself? It's not too late." "I think so," she whispered, her eyes shifting nervously towards the shadows behind. "Quite sure. Only one thing." "What's that?" "You must never leave me alone for an instant." I lost my place again. Why do I keep doing that? As long as you understand that any sound or appearance must be investigated at once, for to hesitate means to admit fear. That is fatal. Agreed, she said, a little shakily. After a moment's hesitation, I'll try. Arm in arm. Shorthouse holding the dripping candle and the stick. Dripping candle and the stick, while his aunt carried the cloak over her shoulders. Figures of utter comedy to all but themselves. They began a systematic search. Stealthily, walking on tiptoe and shading the candle lest it should betray their presence through the shutterless windows, they went first into the big dining room. Now, if this house doesn't have any furniture, how do they know that it's a dining room? Or is like all the houses built the same way? I don't know. There was not a stick of furniture to be seen. Bare walls, ugly mantelpieces, and empty grates stared at them. Everything they felt resented their intrusion, watching them, as it were, with veiled eyes. Whispers followed them. Shadows flitted noiselessly to the right and left. Something seemed ever at their back, watching, waiting an opportunity to do them injury. There was the inevitable sense that operations which went on when the room There was the inevitable sense that operations which went on when the room was empty had been temporarily suspended till they were well out of the way again. The whole dark interior of the old building seemed to become a malignant, that's how you say it, malignant presence that rose up, warning them to desist and mind their own business. Every moment the strain on the nerves increased. Out of the gloomy dining room, they passed through large folding doors into a sort of library or smoking room, wrapped equally in silence, darkness, and dust. From this they regained the hall near the top of the back stairs. Here a pitch-black tunnel opened before them into the lower regions, and it must be confessed they hesitated, but only for a moment. With the worst of the night still to come, it was essential to turn from nothing. Aunt Julia stumbled at the top step of the dark descent, ill lit by the flickering candle, and even Shorthouse felt at least half the decision go out of his legs. "Come on," he said. Oh, God. Preemptly? No, that's preemptorily. You know what? I'm gonna look that up because I have no idea how to say it. Hold on. Let me do this. P-R-E E-M-P-T-O-R-I-L-Y. How do you say it? I don't know if this one said it.
Peremptory.
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 Put in an errand or to be clued. A right of action, debate, or delay. Preemptory.
Peremptory.
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 Okay. Take my glasses off. Come on, he said peremptory. Wait, that's I-L-Y. Peremptorily. Yeah. And his voice ran on and lost itself in the dark, empty spaces below. I'm coming. I'm coming. It's like, if this is odd, that would be weird. I'm coming, she faltered, catching his arm with unnecessary violence. They went a little unsteadily down the stone steps. A cove. How long is this story? 20 pages, yeah. Let me get another sippy. Cold, damp air meeting them in the face. Close and malodorous. The kitchen, into which the stairs led along a narrow passage, was large, with a lofty ceiling. Several doors opened out of it, some into cupboards with empty jars still standing on the shelves, and others into horrible little ghostly back offices, each colder and less inviting than the last. Black beetles scurried over the floor, and once when they knocked against a deal table standing in a corner, something about the size of a cat jumped down with a rush and fled, scampering across the stone floor into the darkness. Everywhere there was a sense of recent occupation, an impression of sadness and gloom. Leaving the main kitchen, they next went towards the scullery. The door was standing ajar, and as they pushed it open to its full extent, Aunt Julia uttered a piercing scream, which she instantly tried to stifle by placing her hand over her mouth. For a second, Shorthouse stood stock still, catching his breath. He felt as if his spine had suddenly become hollow, and someone had filled it with particles of ice. Facing them, directly in their way, between the doorposts, stood the figure of a woman. She had disheveled hair and widely staring eyes, and her face was terrified and white as death. She stood there motionless for the space of a single second. Then the candle flickered, and she was gone utterly. And the door framed nothing but empty darkness. Disco sing, disco sing, disco sing, go sing, go sing. Only the beastly jumping candlelight, he said quickly, in a voice that sounded like someone else's and was only half under control. Come on in, there's nothing here. As I yawned. Come on, there's nothing here. He dragged her forward. With a clattering of feet and a great appearance of boldness, they went on. But over his body the skin moved, as if crawling ants covered it, and he knew by the weight on his arm that he was supplying the force of locomotion for two. The scullery was cold, bare, and empty, more like a large prison cell than anything else. They went around it, tried the door into the yard and the windows, but found them all fastened securely. His aunt moved beside him like a person in a dream. Her eyes were tightly shut, and she seemed merely to follow the pressure of his arm. Her courage filled him with amazement. I've never been in a haunted place, but I'd be more curious than scared, I guess. I mean, as if something was actively trying to hurt me. Where was I? Her courage filled him with amazement. At the same time, he noticed that a certain odd change had come over her face. A change which somehow evaded his power of analysis. There's nothing here, Auntie, he repeated aloud quickly. Let's go upstairs and see the rest of the house. Then we'll choose a room to wait up in. She followed him obediently, keeping close to his side, as they locked the kitchen door behind them. It was a relief to get up again. In the hall there was more light than before, for the moon had traveled a little further down the stairs. Cautiously they began to go up into the dark vault of the upper house, the boards creaking under their weight. On the first floor they found the large double drawing rooms. A search of which revealed nothing. Here also was no sign of furniture or recent occupancy. Nothing but dust and neglect and shadows. They opened the big folding doors between front and back drawing rooms and then came out again to the landing and went on upstairs. They had not gone up more than a dozen steps when they both simultaneously stopped to listen, looking into each other's eyes with a new apprehension across the flickering candle flame. From the room they had left hardly 10 seconds before came the sound of doors quietly closing. It was beyond all question. They heard the booming noise that accompanies the shutting of heavy doors, followed by the sharp catching of the latch. "We must go back and see," said Shorthouse briefly, in a low tone, and turned to go downstairs again. Somehow she managed to drag after him, her feet catching. Did I miss a page? No. Somehow she managed to drag after him, her feet catching in her dress, her face livid. When they entered the front drawing room, it was plain that the folding doors had been closed. Half a minute before, without hesitation, Shorthouse opened them. He almost expected to see something facing him in the back room, but only darkness and cold air met him. They tried in every way to make the doors close of themselves, but there was no wind enough to set the candle flame flickering. The doors would not move without strong pressure. All was silent as the grave. Undeniably, the rooms were utterly empty, and the house utterly still. It's beginning, whispered a voice at his elbow, which he hardly recognized as his aunt's. He nodded. Acquiescence. Taking out his watch to note the time. It was 15 minutes before midnight. He made the entry of exactly what had occurred in his notebook, setting the candle in its case upon the floor in order to do so. It took a minute or two to balance it safely against the wall. Aunt Julia always declared that at this moment she was not actually watching him, but turned her head towards the inner room, where she fancied she heard something moving, but at any rate, both positively agreed that there came a sound of rushing feet, heavy and very swift, and the next instant the candle was out. Normally I'm fine with ghost stories, but just like reading them to yourself, but reading them out loud makes it more scary. I'm fine though. This is cool. I think I lost my page. I had to itch my nose. Alright. Okay, there it is. But Shorthouse himself had come more than this, and he has always thanked his fortunate stars that it came to him alone, and not to his aunt too. For as he rose from the stooping position of balancing the candle, and before it was actually extinguished, a face thrust itself forward so close to his own that he could have almost touched it with his lips. It was a face working with passion. A man's face, dark with thick features and angry, savage eyes. It belonged to a common man, and it was evil in its ordinary, normal expression. No doubt, but as he saw it, alive with intense, aggressive emotion. It was a malignant and terrible human countenance. There was no movement of the air, nothing but the sound of rushing feet. Stockinged, stockinged or muffled feet. The apparition of the face and the almost simultaneous extinguishing of the candle. In spite of himself, Shorthouse uttered a little cry, nearly losing his balance as his aunt clung to him with her whole weight in one moment of real, uncontrollable terror. She made no sound, but simply seized him bodily. Fortunately, however, she had seen nothing, but had only heard the rushing feet. For her control returned almost at once, and he was able to disentangle himself and strike a match. The shadows ran away. The shadows, oh, hold on, my apologies. The shadows ran away on all sides before the glare, and his aunt stooped down and groped for the cigar case with the precious candle. Then they discovered that the candle had not been blown out at all. It had been crushed out. The wick was pressed down into the wax, which was flattened as if by some smooth, heavy instrument. How his companion so quickly overcame her terror. Shorthouse never properly understood, but his admiration for her self-control increased tenfold, and at the same time served to feed his own dying flame, for which he was undeniably grateful. Equally inexplicable to him was the evidence of physical force they had just witnessed. He at once suppressed the memory of stories he had heard of physical mediums and their dangerous phenomena. For if these were true, and either his aunt or himself was unwittingly a physical medium, it meant that they were simply aiding to focus the forces of a haunted house already charged to the brim. It was like walking with unprotected lamps among uncovered stores of gunpowder. So, with as little reflection as possible, he simply relit the candle and went up to the next floor. The arm in his trembled, it is true, and his own tread was often uncertain, but they went on with thoroughness, and after a search revealed nothing, they climbed the last flight of stairs to the top floor of all. Here they found a perfect nest of small servants' rooms, with broken pieces of furniture, dirty cane-bottomed chairs, chests of drawers, cracked mirrors, and decrepit bedsteads. The rooms had low sloping ceilings, already hung here and there with cobwebs, small windows, and badly plastered walls, a depressing and dismal region, which they were glad to leave behind. One note, usually like the servants' quarters are like places where the people work. In haunted places, they're usually haunted the most. Because usually the conditions aren't all that great. And not very good things happen there. So I'm actually surprised I didn't see anything. Where was I? It was on the stroke of midnight when they entered a small room on the 3rd floor, close to the top of stairs, and arranged to make themselves comfortable for the remainder of their adventure. It was absolutely bare, and was said to be the room, then used as a closed closet. What was that? Somebody did something I can't see. Hello, Be barred for life. Thank you. You're a good follow. God, I can't see. I don't have my glasses on. Hold on. I gotta take off my glasses to read, but then I can't actually read anything else because it has to be like right up in my face. Yeah, thank you, B-Bard Life. I think that's how you say your name. For being a follow Godfather. Thank you so much. I don't stream as much as I did because I haven't been feeling great because of Graves' disease and stuff. Not because of what's going on now, but I was just bored. So I'm like, I got all these library books that I can't return, so I might as well read them so other people can have something. Thank you. I forgot where I stopped at. I think it's here. I remember, yeah, closed closet. It was absolutely bare and was said to be the room, then used as a closed closet. Oh, the story I'm currently reading is The Empty House by Algernon Blackwell. And it's 20 pages long and I'm currently on page 14. So, a little halfway done with it, I guess. And I forgot where I was already again. It was obviously bare and was said to be the room, then used as a closed closet, into which the infuriated, it's actually a lot easier to read to yourself than out loud, because you don't have to worry about pronouncing stuff correctly. Into which reading to yourself, if you're unsure of a word, you pronounce it how you think it's supposed to be pronounced, but then you learn you've been saying it wrong the whole time. Okay. into which the infuriated groom had chased his victim and finally caught her. Oh, and so far in the story, they're in an empty house that has been haunted by I forget who it is. Was it a gardener? Yeah, a gardener that killed somebody. If I can find it. I don't remember where it said, like, why the house was even haunted. Got keys. A great deal has happened, yeah. It's a very old house. Yeah, murder committed by a jealous stableman who had some affair with a servant. And he threw her down the banister and she died. No, I don't actually remember what it was. And, like, the house is completely empty, but they've been hearing footsteps, the candle they have. Like, this story doesn't have a time, but I'm guessing since they're using candles, in certain, like, words, how they say things, I think it's 1900s, that this story was either written or it's set in. I'm unsure. But the house is completely empty. The first thing they heard was a person coughing as soon as they closed the front door to the place. They heard footsteps. They saw a woman for 1 second and then she was gone. They looked through some drawing rooms and they went upstairs to check some other rooms. And when they were upstairs, they heard the drawing rooms, the folding screens between the two drawing rooms close. And the latch, they heard the sound of the latch being locked. Or latched, whatever you call it. And when they went back down to check the drawing rooms, they heard more footsteps, and the candle, it wasn't just blown out, the candle was crushed. The exact words was, let me see if I can find it. It had not been blown out. I can't read. It had not been blown out at all. It had been crushed out. Alright, where was I in this story? I think I remembered everything. Yeah, this is as far as I got. I don't remember where I was. I'll just go with this clothes closet, because that's where I remember. It was absolutely bare. I already lost already. And was said to be the room, then used as a clothes closet, into which the infuriated groom had chased his victim and finally caught her. Outside, across the narrow landing. Hiccups. More hiccups. Outside, across the narrow landing, began the stairs leading up to the floor above and the servants' quarters, where they had just searched. What? I'm lost now. Maybe it's because I went over and I stopped. Sorry, like, what? Outside across the narrow landing began the stairs leading up to the floor above. Oh, the landing. I thought, like, they were talking about the stairs. They just left the servants' quarters. And the stairs went back up to the servants' quarters. Like they were stuck in a loop. And now I see it. Outside across the narrow landing began the stairs leading up to the floor above. And these servants' quarters where they had just searched. I got more hair in my eyes than it tickles. In spite of the chillness of the night, there was something in the air of this room that cried for an open window. But there was more than this. Shorthouse could only describe it by saying that he felt less master of himself here than in any other part of the house. There was something that acted directly on the nerves, tiring the resolution, enfeebling the will. He was conscious of this result before he had been in the room 5 minutes, and it was in the short time they stayed there that he suffered the wholesale depletion of his vital forces, which was, for himself, the chief horror of the whole experience. They put the candle on the floor of the cupboard, leaving the door a few inches ajar, so that there was no glare to confuse the eyes, and no shadow to shift about on walls and ceiling. They spread the dark cloak on the floor and sat down to wait, with their backs against the wall. Shorthouse was within 2 feet of the door onto the landing. His position commanded a good view of the main staircase leading down into the darkness, and also of the beginning of the servants' stairs going to the floor above. Oh yeah, and my dog, she snores a lot. Oh God, where was I? And also of the beginning of the servants' stairs going to the floor above. The heavy stick. What did they have a stick? I don't remember. I think they said it once. Somebody had a stick. The heavy stick lay beside him within easy reach. The moon was now high above the house. Through the open window they could see the comforting stars, like friendly eyes watching in the sky. One by one the clocks of the town struck midnight, and when the sounds died away, the deep silence of a windless night fell again over everything. Only the boom of the sea, far away, and the lugubrious, 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 I don't know, far away and lugubrious, filled the air with hollow murmurs. Inside the house, the silence became awful. Awful, he thought, because any minute now it might be broken by sounds portending terror. The strain of waiting told more and more severely on the nerves. They talked in whispers, when they talked at all, for their voices aloud sounded queer and unnatural. A chillness. Why am I having hiccups? A chillness, not altogether due to the night air, invaded the room and made them cold. The influences against them, whatever these might be, were slowly robbing them of self-confidence and the power of decisive action. Their forces were on the wing, and the possibility of real fear took on a new and terrible meaning. He began to tremble for the elderly woman by his side, whose pluck could hardly save her beyond a certain extent. He heard the blood singing in his veins. It sometimes seemed so loud that he fancied it prevented his hearing properly certain other sounds that were beginning very faintly to make themselves audible in the depths of the house. Every time he fastened his attention on these sounds, they instantly ceased. They certainly came no nearer. Yet he could not rid himself of the idea that movement was going on somewhere in the lower regions of the house. The drawing room floor, where the doors had been so strangely closed, seemed too near. The sounds were further off than that. He thought of the great kitchen with the scurrying black beetles, and of the dismal little scullery, but somehow or other they did not seem to come from there either. Surely they were not outside the house. Then suddenly the truth flashed into his mind, and for the space of a minute he felt as if his blood had stopped flowing and turned to ice. The sounds were not downstairs at all. They were upstairs, somewhere among those hard, gloomy little servants' rooms, with their bits of broken furniture. Why did I say broken like that? With their bits of broken furniture, low ceilings, and cramped windows. Upstairs where the victim had first been disturbed and stalked to her death. And the moment he discovered where the sounds were, he began to hear them more clearly. It was the sound of feet, moving stealthily along the passage overhead, in and out among the rooms, and past the furniture. He turned quickly to steal a glance at the motionless figure seated beside him, to note whether she had shared his discovery. The faint candlelight coming through the crack in the cupboard door threw her strongly marked face into vivid relief against the white of the wall. But it was something else that made him catch his breath and stare again. An extraordinary something had come into her face and seemed to spread over her features like a mask. It smoothed out the deep lines and drew the skin everywhere, a little tighter so that the wrinkles disappeared. It brought into the face, with the sole exception of the old eyes, an appearance of youth and almost of childhood. He stared in speechless. Ugh. Do I have more water? Oh, I have a teeny bit. He stared in speechless. God, why do I have trouble with some words and not with others? He stared in speechless amazement. Amazement that was dangerously near to terror. It was his aunt's face, indeed. But it was her face of 40 years ago, the vacant, innocent face of a girl. He had heard stories of that strange effect of terror, which could wipe a human countenance clean of other emotions, obliterating all previous expressions. But he had never realized that it could literally be true, or could mean anything so simply horrible as what he saw now. How does somebody looking younger be scary? I mean, I guess because they look different. Hell, if I could look 40 years younger, I would not be alive, because I'm not even 40 yet. But hell, you can go to more haunted houses. Okay, where was I? For the dreadful signature of overmastering fear was written plainly in that utter vacancy of the girlish face beside him. And when feeling his intense gaze, she turned to look at him, he instinctively closed his eyes tightly to shut out the sight. Yet when he turned a minute later, his feelings well in hand, he saw, to his intense relief, another expression. His aunt was smiling, and though the face was deathly white, the awful veil had lifted, and the normal look was returning. Anything wrong? Was all he could think of to say at the moment, and the answer was eloquent, coming from such a woman. I feel cold and a little frightened, she whispered. He offered to close the window, but she seized hold of him and begged him not to leave her side for an instant. Can I stop having hiccups, please? It's upstairs, I know, It's upstairs, I know, she whispered. I would like to stop having hiccups, with an odd half laugh. But I can't possibly go up. But Shorthouse thought otherwise, knowing that inaction lay there. What? Knowing that inaction, like it's in and then action, not inaction, like not doing anything. Knowing that inaction lay their best hope of self-control. He took the brandy flask and poured out a glass of neat spirit, stiff enough to help anybody over anything. She swallowed it with only a little shiver. His only idea now was to get out of the house before her collapse became inevitable. But this could not safely be done by turning tail and running from the enemy. Inaction was no longer possible. Every minute he was growing less master of himself and desperate. Aggressive measures were imperative without further delay. Moreover, the action must be taken towards the enemy, not away from it. The climax, if necessary and unavoidable, would have to be faced boldly. He could do it now, but in 10 minutes he might not have the force left to act for himself, much less for both. Upstairs the sounds were meanwhile becoming louder and closer, accompanied by the occasional creaking of the boards. Someone was moving stealthily about, stumbling now and then awkwardly against the furniture. Waiting a few minutes to allow the tremendous dose of spirits to produce its effect, and knowing this would last but a short time under these circumstances, Shorthouse then quietly got on his feet, saying in a determined voice, "Now, Aunt Julia, we'll go upstairs and find out what all this noise is about. You must come too. It's what we agreed." He picked up his stick and went to the cupboard for the candle. A limp form rose shakily beside him, breathing hard, and he heard a voice say very faintly something about being ready to come. The woman's courage amazed him. It was much greater than his own, and as they advanced, holding aloft the dripping candle, some stubble force exhaled from this trembling white-faced old woman at his side. That was the true source of his inspiration. It held something really great that shamed him and gave him the support without which he would have proved far less equal to the occasion. They crossed the dark landing, avoiding with their eyes the black space over the banisters. Then they began to mount the narrow staircase to meet the sounds which, minute by minute, grew louder and nearer. About halfway up the stairs, Aunt Julia stumbled, and Shorthouse turned to catch her by the arm. And just at that moment, there came a terrific crash in the servants' corridor overhead. It was instantly followed by a shrill, agonized scream that was a cry of terror and a cry for help melted into one. Before they could move aside or go down a single step, someone came rushing along the passage overhead, blundering horribly, racing madly, at full speed, 3 steps at a time, down the very staircase where they stood. The steps were light and uncertain, but close behind them sounded the heavier tread of another person, and the staircase seemed to shake. Shorthouse and his companion just had time to flatten themselves against the wall when the jumble of flying steps was upon them, and two persons, with the slightest possible interval between them, dashed past at full speed. It was a perfect whirlwind of sound breaking in upon the midnight silence of the empty house. The two runners, pursuer, and pursued, had passed clean through them where they stood, and already with a thud, the boards below had received first one, then the other. Yet they had seen absolutely nothing, not a hand or arm or face or even a shred of flying clothing. There came a second's pause, then the first one, the lighter of the two, obviously the pursued one, ran with uncertain steps into the little room which Shorthouse and his aunt had just left. The heavier one followed. There was a sound of scuffling, gasping, and smothered screaming. And then out on the landing came the step of a single person, treading weightily. A dead silence followed for the space of a half a minute, and then was heard a rushing sound through the air. It was followed by a dull, crashing thud in the depths of the house below, on the stone of the floor of the hall. Utter silence reigned after. Nothing moved. The flame of the candle was steady. It had been steady the whole time, and the air had been undisturbed by any movement whatsoever. Palsied, like frozen. Palsied with terror, Aunt Julia, without waiting for her companion, began fumbling her way downstairs. She was crying gently to herself, and when Shorthouse put his arm around her and half carried her, he felt that she was trembling like a leaf. He went into the little room and picked up the cloak from the floor, and arm in arm, walking very slowly, without speaking a word or looking once behind them, they marched down the 3 flights into the hall. In the hall, they saw nothing but the whole way down. The stairs they were conscious that someone followed them. Oh, in the hall they saw nothing, but the whole way down the stairs they were conscious that someone followed them. Step by step, they went faster. It was left behind them. And when they went more slowly, it caught them up. And when they went more slowly, it caught them up. It's just weird wording right there. But never once did they look behind to see. And at each turning of the staircase, they lowered their eyes for fear of the following horror they might see upon the stairs above. With trembling hands, Shorthouse opened the front door, and they walked out into the moonlight and drew a deep breath of the cool air blowing in from the sea. And that's the end of that story. That was actually pretty cool. I mean, I wish they would have looked behind them, but I mean, they didn't see anything else, so there's probable they wouldn't actually see anything. So I am gonna take a break. I'm gonna get some more water, maybe a little snack. And in a few minutes, I'll come back with The Monkey's Paw by W. Jacobs. So let me change this. There we go. Let me find some music. It's not helping. Fine, I'll just do this. I'm just getting some music to play for the break. Alright, there we go. And I'll be back in a few. So sit tight and get yourself a drink. Do whatever. I'll be back in a couple minutes. Okay, I'm back. Yeah, I know my voice is like going. Somebody got some salsa that was way too spicy. And my throat hates me. Let me get another little throat lozenge thing, maybe that'll help. Probably should have ate something else. I already had 2 cups of water. Alright. I'll be fine now. So, let me find where I stopped it. Let me not do that. Almost hit the end stream. Okay. So the next story is The Monkey's Paw by W. Jacobs. I'm not sure if I've read this or not. It sounds familiar. Maybe I read some other story. It had something about a monkey in it. Was it Green Tea by J. Sheridan Laughing You that had a monkey? I don't remember. Okay. The Monkey's Paw by W. Jacobs. Without, the night was cold and wet, but in the small parlor of more words that but in the small parlor of Lakesnam Villa, the blinds were drawn and the fire burned brightly. Father and son were at chess. The former, who possessed ideas about the game involving radically changes, putting. No, you don't like chess? I don't like chess. It's okay, Viv. I love you. I got to pet my dog. She needs the pets. Get the pet the dog. I love you, Viv. You okay? Alright, where was I? Father and son were at chess. The former, who possessed ideas about the game involving radical changes, putting his king into such sharp and unnecessary perils that it even provoked comment from the white-haired old lady knitting placidly by the fire. "Hark at the wind," said Mr. White, who, having seen a fatal mistake after it was too late, was amiably desirous of preventing his son from seeing it. "I'm listening," said the latter, grimly surveying the board as he stretched out his hand. Check. I should hardly think that he'd come tonight, said his father with his hand poised over the bar. I almost said barred. Over the board. Mate, replied his son. That's the worst of living so far out, bawled Mr. White, with sudden and unlooked-for violence. Of all the beastly, slushly, out-of-the-way places to live in, this is the worst. Hold on. Like, is a recall throat lozenges. They like help. They also make my mouth like super wet and like spit all over everything. Of all the beastly, slushy, out of the way places to live in, this is the worst. Pathways of bog, and the roads a torrent. I don't know what people are thinking about. I suppose only 2 houses on the road are lit. They think it doesn't matter. Never mind, dear, said his wife soothingly. Perhaps you'll win the next one. Mr. White looked up sharply, just in time to intercept a knowing glance between mother and son. The words died away on his lips, and he hid a guilty grin in his thin gray beard. There he is, said Herbert White, as the gate banged too loudly, and heavy footsteps. Some more hiccups. And heavy footsteps came toward the door. The old man rose with hospitable haste, and opening the door, was heard canoodling with the new arrival. The new arrival also canoodled with himself, so that Mrs. White said, "Tut, tut," and coughed gently as her husband entered the room, followed by a tall, burly man, beady of eye, and rubicund, I think that's how you say it, rubicund, a visage. Is it visage or visage? I think it's visage. A visage. Visage sounds better. Sergeant Major Morse, he said, introducing him. The sergeant major shook hands, and taking the preferred seat by the fire, watched contentedly while his host got out whiskey in tumblers and stood a small copper kettle on the fire. At the third glass, his eyes got brighter, and he began to talk. The little family circle regarding with eager interest this visitor from distant parts, as he squared his broad shoulders in the chair and spoke of strange scenes and doughty deeds of wars and plagues and strange peoples. 21 years of it, said Mr. White, nodding at his wife and son. When he went away, he was a slip of youth in the warehouse. Now look at him. He doesn't look to have taken much harm, said Miss White politely. I like to go to India myself, said the old man, just to look round a bit, you know. Better where you are, said the sergeant major, shaking his head. He put down the empty glass and, sighing softly, shook it again. I should like to see those old temples in Fricks. Fakers? I don't know how to say that word. Temples and jigglers, said the old man. Well, this that you started telling me the other day about a monkey's paw or something, Morris? Nothing, said the soldier hastily. Leastways, nothing worth hearing. Monkey's paw? Said Miss White curiously. Well, it's just a bit of it's just a bit of what you might call magic, perhaps, said the sergeant major offhandedly. His three listeners leaned forward eagerly. The visitor absent-mindedly put his empty glass to his lips and then set it down again. His host filled it for him. To look at, said the sergeant major, fumbling in his pocket. It's just an ordinary little paw, dried to a mummy. He took something out of his pocket and proffered it. Mrs. White drew back with a grimace, but her son, taking it, examined it curiously. And what is there special about it? Inquired Mr. White, as he took it from his son, and having examined it, placed it upon the table. Fakir? I don't know. He's just like a magic person. Let me actually look this up because I don't want to accidentally say it wrong. It's Fakir. A Muslim religious aesthetic who lives solely on
Fakir.
Fakir, yeah. Alright, where was I? I had a spell put on it by an old fakir, said the sergeant major. A very holy man. He wanted to show that fate ruled people's lives, and that those who interfered with it did so to their sorrow. He put a spell on it so that 3 separate men could have 3 wishes from it. Thank you. I found this on some site that had free use gifts. I don't exactly remember the site, but I think I googled like free use fireplace gifts or something like that. Where was I? He had a spell put on it so that 3 separate men could have 3 wishes from it. His manner was so impressive that his hearers were conscientious that their light laughter jarred somewhat. Somebody did something, but nothing popped up. Oh, thank you for... I can't read. I can't read and I'm trying to read. Thank you for following Dryland 17. I forgot where I was already. Yeah, he put a spell on it so 3 separate men could have 3 wishes from it. His manner was so impressive, His manner was so impressive that his hearers were conscientious that their light laughter jarred somewhat. Well, why don't you have 3, sir? Said Herbert White cleverly. Is this one of those, like, genie things where you can, like, make wishes, but something bad always happens? I'm not sure if I've read this before or not, but it sounds, like, vaguely familiar. Alright, the soldier regarded him in a way that the middle age... Maybe it's just when this was written, but this one didn't make no sense. The soldier regarded him in the way that middle age is wont to regard presumptuous youth. I think it's just when it was written, because they use words differently. And I'm only, like, I just started, so... I have, he said quietly, in his blotchy face. Let me get a drink, sometimes that helps. I think my tongue doesn't want to work right. I figured since I have trouble reading sometimes, it would help to read out loud. I don't know if it actually helps or not. I have, he said quietly, and his blotchy face whitened. There we go. And did you really have the 3 wishes granted? Asked Miss White. I did, said the sergeant major, and his glass tapped against his strong teeth. And has anybody else wished? Inquired the old lady. The first man has had his 3 wishes, yes, was the reply. I feel a hiccup stuck. It feels so weird. I don't know what the first 2 were, but the 3rd was for death. And that's how I got the paw. Yeah, something has to happen to you to wish to die. Not something good. Alright. His tones were so grave that a hush fell upon the group. If you had your 3 wishes, then it's no good to you now, then, Morris? No, that's not a question. It's no good to you now, then, Morris, said the old man at last. What do you keep it for? The soldier shook his head. Fancy, I suppose, he said slowly. I did have some idea of selling it, but I don't think I will. It has caused enough mischief already. Besides, people won't buy. They think it's a fairy tale, some of them. And those who do think anything of it want to try it first and pay me afterward. If you could have another 3 wishes, said the old man, eyeing him keenly. What would you have? What? Why do I keep wanting to say what? Eyeing him keenly. Would you have them? I don't know, said the other. I don't know. He took the paw, dangling it between his front finger and thumb, suddenly threw it upon the fire. White, with a slight cry, stooped down and snatched it off. Better let it burn, said the soldier solemnly. If you don't want it, Morris, said the old man, give it to me. I won't, said his friend doggedly. I threw it on the fire. If you keep it, don't blame me for what happens. Pitch it on the fire again, like a sensible man. The other shook his head and examined his new possession closely. How do you do it? He inquired. Hold it up in your right hand and wish aloud, said the sergeant major. But I warn you of the consequences. Sounds like the Arabian Nights, said Mrs. White, as she rose and began to set the supper. Why do I have so many hiccups? My dog is like really snoring. Alright. Sounds like the Arabian Nights, said Mrs. White, as she rose and began to set the supper. Don't you think you might wish for 4 pairs of hands for me? Her husband drew the talisman from his pocket, and then all 3 burst into laughter as the sergeant major, with a look of alarm on his face, caught him by the arm. If you must wish, he said gruffly, wish for something sensible. Mr. White dropped it back into his pocket, and placing chairs, motioned his friend to the table. In the business of supper, the talisman was partly forgotten, and afterward the 3 sat listening in an enthralled fashion to a second installment of the soldier's adventures in India. If the tale about the monkey's paw is not more truthful than those he has been telling us, said Herbert, as the door closed behind the guest, just in time for him to catch the last train. We shan't make much out of it. Did you give him anything for it, father? Inquired Miss White. Oh yeah, some married people call each other like father and mother, which I find weird, but I guess it's less confusing for the children. Inquired Miss White, regarding her husband closely. A trifle, said he, coloring slightly. Something like blushing. He didn't want it, but I made him take it. And he pressed me again to throw it away. Likely, said Hubert, with pretended horror. Why, we're going to be rich and famous and happy. Wish to be an emperor, father, to begin with. Then you can't be henpicked. He darted around the table, pursued by the maligned Miss White, armed with an anti-mascar. Actually knows what those are. Those are so this, because they use anti-mascars. I'm pretty sure I'm saying that right. Anti-mascar, I don't know. They used those back in the Victorian times to protect the back of chairs, because the men were using a lot of oil in their hair, and it would get the chairs all oily and dirty. And it's like a piece of cloth to help protect the chair back that you drape over the back of it. Mr. White took the paw from his pocket and eyed it dubiously. I don't know what to wish for, and that's a fact, he said slowly. Seems to me I've got all I want. If you only cleared the house, you'd be quite happy, wouldn't you? Said Herbert. Why did I say Hubert? I know how to say his name. I said it wrong. Said Herbert, with his hand on his shoulder. Well, wish for £200 then, That'll just do it. His father, smiling shamefacedly at his own credulity, credulity, held up the talisman as his son, with a solemn face somewhat marred by a wink at his mother, sat down at the piano and struck a few impressive chords. "I wish for 200 pounds," said the old man distinctly. A fine crash from the piano greeted the words, interrupted by a shuddering cry from the old man. His wife and son ran toward him. "It moved," he cried, with a glance of disgust at the object as it lay on the floor. "As I wished, it twisted in my hands like a snake." Well, I don't see the money," said his son, as he picked it up and placed it on the table. "And I bet I never shall." "It must have been your fancy, father," said his wife, regarding him anxiously. He shook his head. "Never mind, though. There's no harm done. But it gave me a shock all the same." They sat down by the fire again, while the two men finished their pipes. Outside, the wind was higher than ever, and the old man started nervously at the sound of a door banging upstairs. A silence, unusual and depressing, settled upon all three, which lasted until the old couple rose to retire for the night. "I expect you'll find the cash tied up in a big bag in the middle of your bed," said Herbert, as he bade them good night. "And something horrible's squatting up on the top of the wardrobe watching you as you pocket your ill-gotten gains." No, I wonder if the paw... I wasn't going to say this because I find it annoying, but I wonder if the paw didn't mistaken pounds, because this is like India, right? Yeah, India. But by then the British were colonized India. I don't know if the paw would know that the pounds is money, or like 200 pounds of something, like a weight. Let me get a drink of water. Right. In the brightness of the wintry sun next morning, as it streamed over the breakfast table, Herbert laughed at his fears. There was an air of prosaic wholesomeness about the room which it had lacked on the previous night, and the dirty, shriveled little paw was pitched on the sideboard with a carelessness which betokened no great belief in its virtues. "I suppose all old soldiers are the same," said Mrs. White. "The idea of our listening to so much nonsense. How could wishes be granted in these days? As if they could. How could 200 pounds hurt you, father?" "Might drop on his head from the sky," said the frivolously Herbert. "Morris said that the things happen so naturally," said his father, "that you might, if you so wished, attribute it to coincidence. Well, don't break into the money before I come back, said Herbert, as he rose from the table. I'm afraid it'll turn you into a mean, avaricious man, and we shall have to disown you. Why is there like little particles of something like dirt, sand in this book? His mother laughed and, following him to the door, watched him down the road, and returning to the breakfast table, was very happy at the expense of her husband's credulity, all of which did not prevent her from scurrying to the door at the postman's knock, nor prevent her from referring somewhat shortly to retired sergeant majors of bibulous habits when she found that the post bought a tailor's bill. Herbert will have some more of his funny remarks, I expect, when he comes home, she said, as they sat at dinner. I dare say, said Mr. Ow! I got hit in the face by my book. I'm like holding the book open and the pages slipped and it hit me in the eye. But I'm alright. Where was I? I lost where I was. I dare say, said Mr. White, pouring himself out some beer. But for all that, the thing moved in my hand. That I'll swear to. You thought it did, said the old lady soothingly. I say it did, replied the other. There was no thought about it. I had just... What's the matter? His wife made no reply. She was watching the mysterious movements of a man outside, who, peering in an undecided fashion at the house, appeared to be trying to make up his mind to enter. In mental connection with the 200 pounds, she noticed that the stranger was well dressed and wore a silk hat of glossy newness. 3 times he paused at the gate and then walked on again. The 4th time he stood with his hands upon it, and then with sudden resolution flung it open and walked up the path. My dog's making that noise. Oops, I dropped my mouse. Sorry. Don't do that, please. Thank you. Where was I? Mrs. White, at the same moment, placed her hands behind her and hurriedly unfastened the strings of her apron, put that useful article of apparel beneath the cushion of her chair. She brought the stranger, who seemed ill at ease, into the room. He gazed furtively at Mrs. White and listened in a preoccupied fashion as the old lady apologized for the appearance of the room and her husband's coat, a garment which she usually reserved for the garden. She then waited as patiently as her sex would permit for him to broach his business. But he was at first strangely silent. I was asked to call, he said at last, and stooped and picked a piece of cotton from his trousers. I come from Ma and Megan's. The old lady started. Is anything the matter? She asked breathlessly. Has anything happened to Herbert? What is it? What is it? Her husband interposed. There, mother, he said hastily. Sit down and don't jump to conclusions. You've not brought bad news, I'm sure, sir. And he eyed the other wistfully. I'm sorry, began the visitor. Is he hurt? Demanded the mother. The visitor bowed in assent. Badly hurt, he said quietly. But he is not in any pain. Oh, thank God, said the old woman, clasping her hands. Thank God for that. She broke off suddenly as the sinister meaning of the assurance dawned upon her, and she saw the awful confirmation of her fears in the other's averted face. She caught her breath and, turning to her slower-witted husband, laid her trembling old hand upon his. There was a long silence. He was caught in the machinery, said the visitor at length in a low voice. Caught in the machinery? Repeated Mr. White in a dazed fashion. Yes. He sat staring blankly out at the window and, taking his wife's hand between his own, pressed it as he had been wont to do in their old courting days nearly 40 years before. He was the only one left us, he said, turning gently to the visitor. It is hard. The other coughed and, rising, walked slowly to the window. The firm wished me to convey their sincere sympathy with you in your great loss, he said, without looking around. I beg that you will understand I am only their servant and am merely obeying orders. There was no reply. The old woman's face was white, her eyes staring, and her breath inaudible. On the husband's face was a look such as his friend the sergeant might have carried into his first action. I was to say that Ma and Meggins disclaim all responsibility, continued the other. They admit no liability at all, but in consideration of your son's service, they wish to present you with a certain sum as compensation. Mr. White dropped his wife's hand and, rising to his feet, gazed with a look of horror at his visitor. His dry lips shaped the words, "How much?" 200 pounds was the answer. Unconscious of his wife's shriek, the old man smiled faintly, put his hands like a sightless, put his hands like a sightless, God, I said it, put his hands like a sightless man and dropped a senseless heap to the floor. In the huge new cemetery, some 2 miles distant, the old people buried their dead and came back to a house steeped in shadow and silence. It was all over so quickly that at first they could hardly realize it, and remained in a state of expectation, as though of something else to happen, something else which was to lighten this load, too heavy for old hearts to bear. But the days passed, and expectation gave place to resignation, the hopeless resignation of the old, sometimes miscalled apathy. Sometimes they hardly exchanged a word, for now they had nothing to talk about, and their days wore long to weariness. It was about a week after that the old man, waking suddenly in the night, stretched out his hand and found himself alone. The room was in darkness, and the sound of subdued weeping came from the window. He raised himself in bed and listened. "Come back," he said tenderly. "You'll be cold." "It's colder for my son," said the old woman, and wept afresh. The sound of her sobs died away on his ears. The bed was warm, and his eyes heavy with sleep. He dozed fitfully, and then slept until a sudden wild cry from his wife awoke him with a start. "The monkey's paw!" she cried wildly. More water. Oh, I spilled some on my laptop. She cried wildly. "The monkey's paw!" He started up in alarm. "Where? Where is it? What's the matter?" She came stumbling across the room toward him. "I want it," she said quietly. "You have not destroyed it?" "It's in the parlor, on the bracket," he replied, marveling. "Why?" She cried and laughed together, and bending over, kissed his cheek. "I only just thought of it," she said hysterically. "Why didn't I think of it before? Why didn't you think of it?" "Think of what?" he questioned. "The other two wishes," she replied rapidly. We've only had one." "Was that not enough?" he demanded fiercely. "No," she cried triumphantly. "We'll have one more. Go down and get it quickly, and wish our boy alive again." This is not a good idea. The man sat up in bed and flung the bedclothes from his quaking limbs. "Good God, you are mad!" he cried aghast. "Get it," she panted. "Get it quickly and wish." "Oh, my boy, my boy." Her husband struck a match and lit the candle. "Get back to bed," he said unsteadily. "You don't know what you are saying." "We had the first wish granted," said the old woman feverishly. "Why not the second?" "A coincidence," stammered the old man. "Go and get it and wish," cried the old woman, and dragged him toward the door. He went down in the darkness and felt his way to the parlor, and then to the mantelpiece. The talisman was in its place, and a horrible fear that the unspoken wish might bring his mutilated son before him ere he could escape from the room seized upon him, and he caught his breath as he found that he had lost the direction of the door. His brow cold with sweat, he felt his way around the table and groped along the wall until he found himself in the small passage with the unwholesome thing in his hand. Even his wife's face seemed changed as he entered the room. It was white and expectant, and to his fears seemed to have an unusual look upon it. He was afraid of her. "Wish," she cried in a strong voice. "It is foolish and wicked," he faltered. "Wish," repeated his wife. He raised his hand. "I wish my son alive again." The talisman fell to the floor, and he regarded it shudderingly. Then he sank trembling into a chair as the old woman, with burning eyes, walked to the window and raised the blind. He sat until he was chilled with the cold, glancing occasionally at the figure of the old woman peering through the window. The candle end, which had burnt below the rim of the china candlestick, was throwing pulsating shadows on the ceiling and walls, until, with a flicker larger than the rest, it expired. The old man, with an unspeakable sense of relief at the failure of the talisman, crept back to his bed, and a minute or two afterward the old woman came silently and apathetically beside him. Neither spoke, but both lay silently listening to the ticking of the clock. A stair creaked, and a squeaky mouse scurried noisily through the wall. The darkness was oppressive, and after lying for some time, screwing up his courage, that's what it says. It sounds weird to me. The husband took the box of matches and, striking one, went downstairs for a candle. At the foot of the stairs the match went out, and he paused to strike another. And at the same moment a knock, so quiet and stealthily as to be scarcely audible, sounded on the front door. The matches fell from his hand. He stood motionless, his breath suspended until the knock was repeated. Then he turned and fled swiftly back to his room and closed the door behind him. A third knock sounded through the house. "What was that?" cried the old woman, starting up. "A rat," said the old man in shaking tones. "A rat. It passed me down on the stairs." His wife sat up in bed, listening. A loud knock resounded through the house. "It's Herbert," she screamed. "It's Herbert." She ran to the door, but her husband was before her, and catching her by the arm, held her tightly. "What are you going to do?" he whispered hoarsely. "It's my boy. It's Herbert," she cried, struggling mechanically. "I forgot it was 2 miles away. What are you holding me for? Let go. I must open the door." "For God's sake, don't let it in," cried the old man, trembling. "You're afraid of your own son?" she cried, struggling. Yeah. "Let me go. I'm coming. Herbert, I'm coming." There was another knock, and another. The old woman, with a sudden wrench, broke free and ran from the room. Her husband followed to the landing, and called after her appealingly as she hurried downstairs. He heard the chain rattle back and the bottom bolt drawn slowly and swiftly from the socket. Then the old woman's voice, strained and panting. "The bolt," she cried loudly. "Come down, I can't reach it." But her husband was on his hands and knees, groping wildly on the floor in search of the paw. If he could only find it before the thing outside got in. A perfect fusillade. Is it perfect? Yeah, fusillade of knocks reverberated through the house, and he heard the scraping of a chair as his wife put it down in the passage against the door. He heard the creaking of the bolt as it came slowly back. And at the same moment, he found the monkey's paw and frantically breathed his third and last wish. The knocking ceased suddenly. Although the echoes of it were still in the house, he heard the chair drawn back and the door opened. A cold wind rushed up the staircase, and a long, loud wail of disappointment and misery from his wife gave him courage to run down to her side and then to the gate beyond. The street lamp flickering opposite shone on a quiet and deserted road. And that's the end. If you ever watched any shows about bringing back somebody from the dead, it's never a good idea. Never a good idea. Because, like in Practical Magic, they say it's not the same. So, hold on. The first story I read was The Empty House by Algernon Blackwell. The story I just finished now was The Monkey's Paw by W.W. Jacobs. And I think that's all I'm going to read for today. The next story is The Legend of Sleepy Hollow by Washington Irving. And that's a long one, which I don't think my voice can handle right now. So, let me check something. Let me see who's on. Oh, Kiwo. Do people like Kiwo? Alright, hold on. Or people rather have Animal Crossing? I don't know, I kind of like Animal Crossing. That's pretty cool. I haven't streamed since they do this new layout, so I'm not 100% used to it. Alright, so we're gonna raid Cashmane. She's playing Animal Crossing. I think she's a really cool person, and I love her hair. Anyway, thank you for watching so much. Goodbye. Goodbye. I'm gonna hit this. There we go.